when we started this research, we were thinking about the way that growth affects the way that multi-academy trusts have to operate. So we'd been conscious of the fact that as you grow, there are certain aspects of your operating model that have to flex and adapt. We termed these things breakpoints, so a point of non-incremental change where it might have to break with a previous operational approach and make a shift. What interested us as we went through the research was that actually those breakpoints weren't just triggered by growth, they were triggered by a number of other things as well. So for example, changes in geography, policy context, and also the performance of schools in a multi-academy trust. And so what we really wanted to do with this section was to highlight the types of things that a CEO needs to be conscious of in advance and, where possible and within financial constraints, may want to plan in advance and prepare for. But as an example, we found a point around accountability and oversight where in the very early stages of a trust, many leaders were quite comfortable with a fairly loose amount of official accountability and oversight in place. And that was because they were still able to maintain a lot of personal contact with those schools and really to be on the ground. And there was a sense of actually at that smaller scale, it was still manageable to have that kind of difference between schools. But what they found was as the trust grew, and actually the numbers involved both of pupil outcomes and of financials grew, then they really needed to tighten up their oversight of the schools, because there's a difference between, for example, 100,000 and 1 million in terms of that level of responsibility that they had, or the number of pupils that they needed to have oversight over. And so we got a sense there of a breakpoint with accountability and oversight, of having to really put much tighter systems in place in order to maintain it and to kind of be commensurate with the level of accountability that the CEO had. The final one I'll touch on here is around communication. And here we saw that tension again between the very personal level of communication that trust leadership could achieve with a small number of schools, and then this step change where actually you can't, for example, visit a school a week, it's not possible to bring together all your staff in one room anymore, and need to think much more consciously about how to achieve consistency of communication when you are more remote. And a kind of step change in the way that you have to go about that, with perhaps more consistent systems for communicating to all the schools in the trust. And so there we really again observed a step change with scale, that communications needed to adapt and become more kind of, I don't want to say depersonalised because it's not that, but you had to step away from being able to be in the room and actually thinking about different ways to reach people who are perhaps also further afield. And then performance, and this goes kind of back to Peter's point, around what happens as performance changes in each of the scenarios where there is either consistency or autonomy. So for those trusts veering towards consistency, we found that there could be a ceiling to that approach. So essentially some of the trusts working towards a consistent model reported that they felt that actually a school could reach a point where they felt actually we need to loosen the reins a bit and we need to give them a little bit more freedom and hold them less closely to this aligned approach if we're going to see their performance continue to grow and improve. But then in contrast with those trusts that were really focused on autonomy and preserving that, they often felt that actually where outcomes were poor, they need an approach imposed from the centre or from a school improvement team, because they recognised that if a school had been given the opportunity to improve and hadn't demonstrated that improvement, then they needed to have a way of raising standards very quickly to ensure that children were achieving the outcomes that they deserved. So essentially, whether we were looking at trusts that started with a premise of we believe in consistency in an area or autonomy in an area, then depending on the level of performance of a school, there could be tensions and breakpoints there. And that is a kind of whistle-stop through breakpoints. As I said, there is more detail in the booklets as well, so please feel free to dig into those.